Hello everyone, welcome to CultureTalk, where we share insights and learnings from leaders in arts and culture. Today we're asking why running an arts centre can be one of the loneliest jobs in the cultural sector, what's missing from the conversation about long-term sustainability, and how peer networks are changing how cultural leaders think. To help us unpack all this, I'm joined by Annabel Turpin and Gavin Barlow, co-directors of Future Arts Centres, a network representing more than 170 arts centres across the UK. Annabel is also Chief Executive of Storyhouse in Chester and sits on the National Council of Arts Council England. Gavin was Chief Executive and Artistic Director of the Albany in Deptford for over 20 years, transforming it into one of London's most successful cultural hubs. He's now the Capital Project Director for the venue. Between them, they've spent decades running art centres and now lead Future Art Centres, an organisation dedicated to strengthening the sector through advocacy, peer learning and research. So hi, Annabel. Hi, Gavin. Before we get into the meat of today's conversations, I'd love to hear a bit about each of your journeys. How did you find your way into arts and culture and what's kept you here? Shall we start with your story, Annabel?
Okay, I'll keep it brief. I mean, I've had a very linear career through art centres, but I did the usual, drama at school, got into running events when I was a student, and got my first job at Warwick Arts Centre in Coventry after I graduated there. And from there, I've only ever worked in art centres. I moved to an art centre in Maidenhead and helped open a brand new art centre. Northern Farm Centre for the Arts there. Then moved up to the North East and worked at Stockton Arts Centre, also known as ARC. And then about 2 years ago, moved across to Chester to run Storyhouse, which is one of the country's largest art centres. So I'm art centre through and through.
Great. And your story, Gavin?
Well, I'm not quite art centre through and through, although I did start my career at an art centre called the Green Room, which unfortunately no longer exists in Manchester, and kind of fell into it accidentally, really, because I'd come home from university, didn't have a job, was in Manchester, and just started volunteering at the Green Room. I had other intentions, kind of career-wise, but just got really fascinated and interested in the work that they were doing, and then got a job there. So then that was me set. And then I worked there, and I worked in Manchester, and I set up a festival called Queer Up North. And then I guess probably my late 20s, early 30s, I moved to London and kind of lost my way a little bit, I think. Still working in the arts, but in different bits of the arts. And then I moved back to Manchester, actually, to be executive director at Contact. And I kind of refound my love and kind of passion for what I was doing, and realized, because Contact then, as it is now, was a theatre for young people, but actually ran like an art centre, I would say. And so I was really excited by seeing the real difference of the work that we were doing there, day in, day out. And I suppose that found kind of real meaning in what I was doing. From there, went to the Albany and stayed there for 22 years until last year. So, yeah, in a nutshell, that's it.
Yeah. I feel people often, once they kind of latch on to that meaningfulness within the sector and that passion for the sector, often kind of get stuck in it. You find it hard to leave. And I think that's how a lot of people feel. And for anyone unfamiliar with the network, what is the Future Arts Centre and what are you ultimately trying to achieve?
So it's a network. You said over 170. I think we're just over 180 now. So obviously constantly growing network of art centres across the UK. And they're all kind of art centres, and I guess we don't have a hugely strict definition of art centres, but they're usually multi-art form, often kind of with a focus on performing arts, but certainly have a really strong civic and community focus to their work. They're typically kind of buildings that are open all day and all evening, not just in the evenings for shows. So having that kind of role in their communities. And Future Art Centres, it started in 2013, and it just started as a network of 9 art centres, which, going back to what you were saying at the beginning, it can be a lonely job. So it was just 9 leaders of art centres coming together and supporting each other, really. And that that focus on peer support has stayed throughout the process. It was also about advocacy for art centres, because feeling like there was strong advocacy for theatre and for other parts of the sector, particularly kind of single art forms, and the art centres had become a little bit lost in the mix, which I think is not the case now. So like I credit future art centres a little bit for doing that. But it remains a peer support network. It's now funded by the Arts Council. We do deliver a lot of large strategic projects around various things. But I suppose at its heart, apart from peer support and apart from advocacy for the unique role of art centres, it's really there to support leadership development and drive innovation within art centres. And I think we also have a bit of a mission to kind of have an influence on the art sector more generally. Maybe to make the rest of the art sector a bit more art centre in its approach. So yeah, we have a wider mission as well in that sense.
Right.
I'm sure, Annabel, you probably want to add something in there. But...
No, I think you've covered everything. That's how I would describe it.
I mean, you mentioned two things I'd like to unpack a bit there, loneliness and advocacy. Were there times, in your roles, either currently or in the past, where you really felt that loneliness, and that's kind of what triggered you? And why is loneliness so prevalent, is my first question. And the second is, why was getting advocacy within the sector so difficult? And why was it that you prompted to start Future Art Centres in order to get that advocacy?
Okay, we'll take the loneliness bit first. I've definitely felt lonely in my career, and I guess usually at times when things are really hard and you're trying to deal with something and you're having to project confidence to your board and to your staff and your customers and artists, and you're the person that's kind of holding it all together. And I think it's particularly heightened in art centres because so much about running an art centre is about balance. It is about balance of art form and community need and the people that you're kind of working with, the finances, the cross-subsidy model that often sits at the heart of art centres. It's all about balance. So you can literally feel like the person that's holding everything in the middle. I mentioned I moved up to Stockton in the northeast, which is, is or was, maybe not so much now, but was quite sort of quite a forgotten place, and very, very little arts infrastructure in that area. And it did feel really lonely. And I suppose my worry was that I'd be sitting there thinking I was doing good things, but actually, people all over the country would be, whizzing past me doing loads of really innovative things that I wouldn't be hearing about in my kind of slightly isolated kind of position. So I think that's when I probably felt particularly isolated, and where that network of art centres really came into play to sort of help manage that. So I think, for me, it's partly because of that sort of pivotal part you play in the sort of in the design of an art centre.
The way you kind of describe the role of art centres, the function that you play within community, it does sound like a very pivotal role, almost very high pressure. It's almost like you're playing a counsellor role within an organisation, and I can see how that can feel very lonely, especially when you're balancing so many different audiences. How does the Future Art Centres help leaders within those organisations kind of contend with that role? Understand, how to. I mean, it's almost like you can't please everyone, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why loneliness comes about as well, right?
I think that's fair. Yeah, you have to learn that you can't please everyone in what you're trying to do, and that can be difficult. I mean, as I said, we're a peer support network, and so we have an online peer support. We have lots of opportunities for people to come together. We do kind of 3, I guess, national meetings a year, which brings together most of the art centre leaders, but do lots of online sessions around various things. And I have to say, every time a new person joins, they're like, oh my God, it's other people are having these same problems, and just to be able to share them. And I thought it was just me, or and somebody else had a solution or had some way of looking at this. I think somebody at the last meeting said, so many things that I was sharing with other people, and also so many problems I didn't realize I had that I need to look at. Which is maybe slightly less fortunate, but I just think that sense of people in a similar role in different parts of the country, maybe in different circumstances and different contexts, but obviously like sharing so much in what they're having to contend with. I think that's just so powerful in that peer person-to-person support. And it also, as an organisation, we're a tiny organisation, but actually that just makes it more powerful as a group, because we're not drawing on, the team at Future Art Centres. We're drawing on the leaders of 170, 180 different art centres across the country, who will all have something to offer or something to be able to support somebody else with. And so, yeah, that's the key to it, I think.
I think what we try and then do, and it is always a balance of just giving people enough time and space together, whether that's virtual or in person, to just have that, someone else has got the same problem, that kind of conversation, that affirmation almost that you are doing a good job and these problems are normal and everyone's having them, you're not doing something wrong to cause them. So there's that bit of it. But then what we then try and do is carve out the time and the kind of the stimulus to help people think differently or to take a different perspective on something that they're doing, so that they're hopefully leaving, having shared their problems and compared them to other people, but perhaps with one or two things that are actually going to help them on a practical basis. And that takes lots of different shapes. That might be, we had a big session last year where we brought people together, particularly to look at kind of managing buildings, and particularly the kind of the repairs and maintenance part of buildings. It's a big issue in the sector at the moment. So that took a slightly different form. It was very practical. We had people from different organisations coming in to talk to us. Sometimes it is much more of a kind of an internal discussion in a way, where there's a particular area or provocation will invite people to kind of discuss, to help them, as I say, just sort of think a bit differently and think about an area they might explore that will help them in running their art centre.
Yeah, I wanted to dive into that a bit more in terms of when arts centre leaders come to Future Art Centre meetings, what are the conversations that keep coming up and what's keeping them up at night? Obviously, you mentioned kind of buildings and buildings management there. We've mentioned loneliness, but what are the other conversations that keep coming up that you're often supporting leaders with?
I mean, there's a whole variety. Oh, sorry, go on, Annabel, you jump in.
I was just going to say, I think for me, the key ones are probably, the financial side, balancing the books. Art centres thrive on a mixed income model, so most art centres are deriving their income from a number of different sources. So just balancing that, making sure that everything is working is a key one. I think the sort of meeting the expectations of that civic role is also a key one. It's brilliant to be able to work with communities in the way that we do, and to be able to work so deeply and meet their kind of needs and interests. But as we've seen other kind of social infrastructure shrink, the pressure on art centres to step into that gap in a way has got more and more, particularly around things like health and wellbeing and youth services. So managing those expectations, wanting to meet them, but actually whether you've got enough money and enough resource and enough expertise and the right kind of expertise in the organisation to meet those expectations. And then probably the third one is around staff welfare. And people are leading increasingly complex lives. New generations of into the workforce have different expectations of their employers, and actually just adapting and balancing running a business and meeting the needs of staff and making sure you're managing their kind of well-being is probably the third one. I think they're the ones for me. What would you say, Gavin?
I think they're right, and I think obviously that first one you mentioned around the real pressure of trying to balance the books. I mean, that's the same across the sector, probably most sectors, but particularly if you're running a building in terms of costs accelerating, and how to make sense of business models, increasingly complex business models. And I think it is about that balance as well, in the sense that we are running charities and we are running businesses, and having to kind of balance those two things and to make them work together can sometimes be complicated. I think, there's a sense in which, your strength is your weakness. I think that's often the case for art centres. And I think the great strength of art centres is they have such amazing potential, that they're working across so many different areas and different cross-sector kind of partnerships, and meaning so much in their local areas and being able to achieve so much. But actually, of course, that's also a huge pressure because, as you say, managing expectations, or if you're a leader, it's like, well, there's 100 things that I can be doing and should be doing, but I haven't got the resources or the capacity to do them. How am I going to prioritize? How am I going to balance? So I think, there is still huge potential, even in difficult times, particularly for art centres. But sometimes finding the right balance or finding the right way through is quite difficult to achieve.
I think something that is well recognised within the sector, but something I wish people outside the sector understood better, was how kind of unique and obscure sometimes arts organisations are in terms of the many different roles, the different funding patterns, the fact that you are managing buildings that are kind of a lot more independently than perhaps other sectors do. And that perhaps does broadly paint a picture of why there are so many challenges within the sector, because it's not just a normal business that you might have in another sector, right? And I think this is why finance, the financial kind of struggles and challenges come up a lot, because it is a sector that does need financial support. And that's something I'd like to move on to next, because you recently published research, I think late last year, that put numbers to some of these challenges. What did that research reveal about the financial reality art centres are operating in, and what worried you more than you expected from that research?
I think the positives were that art centres remained really resilient in general. They had really, earned income was a big part of the business models for most art centres. It was usually kind of 60, 70%. But also they had really diverse earned income models. So it wasn't just ticket sales, it was a whole variety of things, food and beverage and renting out places and renting out spaces rather, and consultancy, etc. So kind of being able to use your buildings and adapt. So there were clearly evidence that they were being, very adaptive and entrepreneurial in making things work. I think, what was slightly worrying was income from trusts and foundations was down. Income from local authority funding was coming down and had come down. So, all of that funding was making them very vulnerable. So margins were very tight. And I guess the other thing, apart from the fact that the buildings needed a lot of investment, was that reserves were very much reduced for a lot of art centres. So although they were working hard to kind of adapt and being quite successful, they were, a lot of art centres, and I think this is true for a lot of arts buildings, are quite close to the edge. There's not much to fall back on when if things go wrong. So although resilient in some ways, also I think really vulnerable, or a lot of vulnerable organisations within its sector. Yeah.
And in the report as well, there was a point made about how every £1 of public subsidy unlocks over £6 from other sources. And that's a really impressive return. But if that data is that compelling, what's blocking policymakers from acting on it? Is it ideology, misunderstanding, political incentives, or something else?
It's a difficult one. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I guess specifically for art centres, and maybe that takes us on to the sort of advocacy point that you made earlier. I think art centres have often been the kind of poor relations within the kind of wider art sector, and part of the reason that Future Art Centres has led with a sort of led with so much advocacy, has been about trying to raise the profile of the important part in the wider ecology that art centres play. So we're not saying art centres are better than anyone else. We're just saying they have a real value and a real importance in the wider ecology, because they are different to art form-led organisations like theatres or dance houses or museums. You know, they are fundamentally really led by communities and the sort of what the needs of their communities are, rather than being focused on a single art form. So they're starting from a different point. So we've been sort of championing their importance, and maybe that message about the kind of, you know, I'd say traditionally art centres have been underinvested in terms of public subsidy. I would say that, wouldn't I? I've only ever worked in them, but, you know, compared to some other art forms. So maybe that message about how much is unlocked hasn't got through, just in the way that some of the messages about the value of art centres haven't got through.
I think that's right in terms of looking at the funding system. If you look at the Arts Council, the national funding system, there's a kind of historical structural underfunding of art centres, where they've been treated as kind of receiving houses which need less money than the producers. And of course, that's all shifted. You know, theatres are producing in different ways. Art centres are now producing a lot of the work they do in partnership with lots of people. And so it feels like, as often happens, the structures of funding systems have lagged behind. And although policies change and strategies change, the kind of fundamental historical kind of imbalances haven't really been addressed for lots of political reasons. And I think that's a difficult one, but obviously one that needs to be addressed. I think the other thing is that traditionally art centres have been more funded by local authorities. And actually, although national funding's been under pressure, the local authority funding has decreased massively. So actually, they've been much more vulnerable to funding cuts. I think if had, you know, the ear of the Secretary of State, I'd be, and this isn't brought up very much, but I'd be quite interested in the idea of local authorities having a statutory duty to support culture, which they don't at the moment. I think that could be a bit of a game changer in the way that we're thinking around culture. In terms of local funding and local support.
You mentioned advocacy there earlier as well, and something I've always thought about within the sector is the way we communicate the value of culture and arts. And I've always felt sometimes I've felt it's always been a bit cliche and a bit predictable in the way we can kind of communicate the value, because it clearly doesn't resonate, some of the messaging that we share. But perhaps future art centres might have some insights to share there in the way that you're able to kind of communicate the power of civic duty, the power of community building. Is that something you feel the broader sector can learn from art centres more in terms of the way we communicate the value of cultural organisations? That it's not just about, you know, that we need to protect this production and protect the artistic value, which obviously has value, but perhaps what might resonate more is that community value, that civic value that you both touched on a lot.
Yeah, I think that is the case. And as you say, it's important to sort of recognise both arguments. But I think what we're trying to do, and one of the sort of areas of work we've been doing through Future Arts Centres, is about talking about our impact. I think all arts organisations are really good at talking about what they do, but actually what we need to talk about is the difference that we're making. And as you said, the difference we're making to local people. So that's something we've been working on both for ourselves in sort of telling the bigger story, but also trying to support individual art centres to really think about how to measure their impact and to tell that story themselves, because that is the compelling bit. And we do use a story-based evaluation methodology, because stories are the thing that people will remember far more than those statistics.
Yeah,
I think you're right. I think some advocacy for the arts does come across, or can come across, as a bit entitled. It's a bit like an assumption that, you know, that we need to exist, you know, and of course we believe that, and of course we absolutely believe in the kind of the power of arts and culture to change lives, but actually you can't assume that your audience is going to know that or experience that or have that in their own lives. You need to be able to demonstrate the impact in, you know, to real people in real terms across the country. And I think in a sense, you know, it's it's sometimes difficult for the arts because I think it has such a wide area of benefits in terms of kind of social benefits and economic benefits, and as you were saying, kind of those civic and community building that it can achieve. But I think actually we've sometimes been focusing on the wrong areas, or not really kind of been looking at the real power of arts in communities across the country in a way that hopefully we are with future art centres. Although I have to say, I don't know whether, I would say communications from art centres is probably something we're trying to address as a kind of network, feeling like that's probably not an area where we've been as strong as we need to be. And I think that's something we really, as future art centres, focusing on how we can improve those communications, how we can, as a network, but also kind of equip individual art centres to be able to tell their story in a compelling and effective ways. Yeah.
I'd like to move on to more the kind of policy shifts that you guys have been trying to advocate for. Obviously, you've both been advocating for art centres for decades now. I'm interested, where have you managed to shift policy within the sector, and where are you still banging your head against the wall?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's hard sometimes to demonstrate, isn't it? I think certainly, going back 10 years, even within the Arts Council, art centres weren't featured, but now they are. They're understood, and the kind of value of them is understood. So I think we can see that change. I think, in a small part, you mentioned the capital report we did last year with Arab, and obviously we managed to get, a huge international company like Arab with lots of expertise and research expertise to support us pro bono into building a really comprehensive report. And I think that had some success. I mean, it was when there was a parliamentary question, that report was cited by the Arts Minister as evidence. I think it was the only evidence cited directly in the Hodge review of the Arts Council before Christmas, evidence of the issues around capital funding and capital infrastructure for the arts. So I kind of like to think that the £1.5 billion announcement, that we had some contribution to that we had some positive contribution to that. So that's, we might as well claim that a little bit. There were lots of other people, but lots of other things. But I think we probably had some contribution to that, which is brilliant because it's absolutely necessary. In the absence of increased revenue, then the need for kind of capital investment is essential, not only to keep the buildings going, but enable us to kind of be able to generate income from those buildings. Otherwise, the whole thing becomes impossible. I think some areas where we definitely keep trying and never seem to get anywhere, but certainly we wanted to trying to encourage government to extend theatre tax relief around more community participatory type work, which would be really powerful for art centres, I think, in terms of their incomes. And we seem to have got some way with that a few times, but not as far as we need to.
I think probably in broader terms, and I don't think these are necessarily things we've failed at. Maybe they're things we haven't yet done enough around. I'm not sure that we've really made the case for how art centres contribute to some of the other kind of areas and other sort of government priorities. So beyond the arts, some of the kind of within that sort of more civic role. There's huge amounts of work going on within creative health. It feels like maybe the argument there is one, but it feels like actually there's in terms of the sort of the New Pride in Place programme, for example, that is obviously very community led, as it should be. It feels like art centres should be at the heart of those kind of programmes. The youth strategy would be another example where that doesn't really doesn't kind of reference art centres in any particular way, but I think we've got a massive part to play in helping to deliver that youth strategy. And then I think within, perhaps on the more kind of creative artistic side, I don't think art centres are recognised as producers of art in the way that art form led organisations are. And we are producers of art all the time. And, as Gavin said, that the sort of the very old-fashioned traditional way of thinking about venues that receive work, that is touring, and venues that produce work themselves. They're so blurred now, and art centres are doing far more work that is actually about developing artists and developing work in response to kind of local needs and interests. So I don't think art centres are recognised as producers quite in the way that they should be. Maybe that's something we should address, Gavin.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think that's really fair. I think at a local level, I think also shifting the mindset, both of art centres and local authorities, for that sense of, art centres aren't just part of the cultural provision in the local area that needs support, which they do, but actually they have huge potential to be strategic partners in community development and placemaking, and kind of being an important part of that local area. So as things become more difficult, because you were talking about, Annabel, that kind of spread of areas where art centres in particular could have an impact. And I think recognising that at a local level would be really powerful for kind of art centres and local authorities to work better in partnerships to achieve things together. And I suppose it's just, it's kind of, and it's as much for art centres as for local authorities. It's just shifting that mindset. Is, what's the potential? And actually that can also unlock other funding and other resources further down the line if you're thinking about it in that way.
I often use the example of whenever there's a conversation going on within a local authority or within sort of key local civic stakeholders, like if there's a university in that place, the university will always be part of that conversation. And if they're not, someone around the table will always say, we should talk to the university about that. And art centres should be referenced in the same way, in my view. And I think that's, we want people to really recognise them as being the anchor institutions that they are, and to make sure that we are in those conversations to play that strategic role, because I think we are able to voice the kind of the needs and interests of our communities so well, and we have an incredible amount of trust. That's the other thing. We build up a lot of trust with local communities through the work that we do, and I think that's a really important element, really, in kind of local democracy.
I was going to kind of come on to that point a bit about how you kind of get art centre voices heard at the table a bit more. What kind of practice are you putting into place to kind of shift mindsets around that a bit more?
So, I mean, part of it is doing podcasts like this, making sure that art centres are getting discussed in a way that perhaps they weren't 10, 20 years ago. But yeah, we work quite a lot with MPs. We're in correspondence with MPs quite regularly about different issues, with other kind of key stakeholders. The Arts Council, not just in England, but we have members in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales as well. So it is about looking at who is doing the strategic thinking, who could our potential partners be, and then just approaching them and talking to them, and trying to make sure that we're contributing to their priorities and their thinking in a positive way. It's not about, woe us, nobody's taking any notice of us. That's not how we're approaching it. It's much more about what we can contribute and what we can bring to that conversation.
Yeah, I think art centre leaders are quite a modest bunch in general. And, naturally we're kind of focused on what we're doing day to day. And actually, I suppose we're also encouraging leaders to have the confidence to stake their claim, really, and to, actually, yeah, of course, you can contact the leader of the council or the CEO of the council and talk about, what's on your agenda, as well as kind of what's on their agenda and how you can support them. But I think a lot of it is, I think, we've been a little bit, I think, across the sector, been a little bit retreating into our own little worlds in some ways. And so I think having the confidence, being able to kind of just look outside of what we're doing day to day, but just the confidence to step up and kind of stake your claim. And I think that's really, it's hard to kind of quantify that, but I think it's a really, really important part of what we need to do.
I think the other thing is about amplifying the work that is going on in art centres. So we have published a number of reports with We've just published one around individual giving based on some work we've been doing with a group of art centres exploring what individual giving looks like at a sort of fairly small scale level. And I think amplifying some of the work that is going on in art centres also gives people confidence in what they're doing as well. It's like, actually, this work is valuable and valid and of interest, not just to us, but to other people and to other people in the sector. You know, there's lots of practice within art centres that I think is useful for other parts of the sector to see and hear about, and perhaps adapt and adopt in their settings. So I think some of that sharing and amplification is also important.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I find the Future Art Centres reports one of the most insightful ones that everyone should be following in the sector. And we'll link to that later because they're ones that everyone should be kind of checking up on. But you also mentioned about advocacy with your kind of local authority. It might be your local MP or even the national MP, the Culture Secretary. Is that something Future Art Centres can help art centre leaders with in terms of, I guess, more voices is more powerful than just a single lonely voice, as we said at the start. And how do you kind of go about kind of ensuring there's representation from your local MPs and even on a national level?
Yeah, I mean, we've been writing to them with art centre leaders. So obviously, not every MP has an art centre in their constituency, sadly. Maybe one day, but most do. So we have been, writing with art centre leaders to their local MP. We've done some briefings for individual MPs. We've connected them up so that we've encouraged them to visit their art centre, which is really the best way, and most local MPs actually will go to their local art centre and visit and listen and learn about what's going on there. So it is about, sort of building those relationships at a local level, and something that we've helped do.
And what is it that you're often asking for from your local MP, or if you had the ear of the Culture Secretary, what would you be telling them?
Well, obviously, previous kind of campaigns have been around fiscal events. So before the budget last June, before the spending review last June and the budget in October, we were asking particularly for support for art centres, particularly for capital. And it's fantastic, as Gavin says, that message, not just from us, but from many other parts of the sector that have buildings, has been heard. But also, we do ask them to connect with their local art centre. That's a really key thing. And to help us try and really make the case to some of those other government departments. We can be very focused, and we know that sometimes government departments don't necessarily talk to each other that much, but actually understanding the breadth of what art centres do and helping us get into some of those other conversations has been one of our asks as well.
Yeah. It's interesting, that question, actually. Just making an ask is something people that often don't do, making contact with an MP or a politician. And I think it just sounds so simple and so basic, but I remember a situation we were in and where somebody kind of said, well, what are you asking for? And it's like, oh, yes, we hadn't really thought about that. But it's a really important lesson. It's just a clear, simple act. But also things people can achieve. Of course we'd like lots more funding, but that might not be achievable in the short term. But there will always be things that we can ask for very specifically at different levels, MPs, ministers, council leaders, that can be achievable. And that can help kind of shift the dial in some ways.
And not always money. Sometimes it might be about introductions to other people, opening doors, connecting with other organisations, making sure we're part of some of those strategic conversations. So it's not always about money.
I mean,
although it's always about money.
It helps. I want to pick on something you mentioned earlier, which is about mindset, because a lot of what the Future Art Centres does seems to be about helping leaders think differently. Why is shifting mindset so critical at this current juncture in arts and culture, and how do you shift mindsets?
I think the reason it's so important at the moment is that we're having to adapt to change. Change is speeded up, as people know. The pace of change has speeded up. So we're needing to adapt much more than much quicker than we've had to do in the past. As human beings, I mean, not just art centre leaders, but for all of us, we're using new technologies daily, probably, whereas previously it might have been every decade. So that need to be really adaptable and to have a mindset that is really open to change and seeing change as a constant is part of being able to do your job well and part of being able to be resilient in your job. So I think that's why it's particularly critical at the moment. I think in terms of how we do that, it is about the sort of collective nature of future art centres. You're not on your own with this. It's okay. No one else knows how to do it either. We're all making it up as we go along. We're all learning together. I think that's quite empowering, actually, for people to feel. It is about sharing expertise, and sometimes it's better when that's shared informally. So you can go to a training session and an expert can talk to you about how to do something, and you can feel a bit inadequate and think, I'm never going to get this. Actually sharing expertise informally with someone else who is a peer, who's learning, maybe just a couple of steps ahead of you. Again, sometimes that just lands better when you're a very busy person, with 20 challenges on your desk and you haven't really got time. And I think it is about sort of trying to build an environment where testing things is okay. So I mentioned some of the individual giving work we've been doing, and we've done a series of different essentially action research groups over the last couple of years that has been about supporting people to explore different things in a way that hopefully feels safe. No one's judging. We're all kind of learning and testing this together. But those groups provide a bit of accountability. So it's not the thing that drops off the to-do list. You're part of a group, you've got to do it. But also the support. So it's a kind of safety net in a way to help people think differently and try something out in a safe way.
I think we all, we've all got really busy day jobs and we're all trying to achieve practically so many things on a day-to-day basis. So it's easy to get really kind of almost narrow in your thinking. It's like delivering what you have to deliver today. So I suppose part of our role is supporting people to kind of take a step back, look at the bigger picture, look at the connections, look at the possibilities and the potential they do and what they can do. I think, in terms of change as well, I think we, as a sector, we've been waiting for the funding to come in, if you like, or changing of the funding situation. And, I don't think for a second we should stop making that argument. But actually, there may not be a huge influx of funding coming in anytime soon. I don't think so. So actually, we do need to adapt and change. And so it needs to be a twin track. We need to be making the case, of course, for public investment. But actually, we also need to be adapting and changing really quite quickly. I think there's a sense in which the sector's also maybe a little bit risk averse. And I think that's probably reinforced by our kind of charity structures, like kind of old fashioned Victorian governance models that don't support kind of risk-taking and entrepreneurial kind of behaviour. And actually, I do think we need to think about that both at a kind of the level of leadership within art centres and within the art sector about how we shift that and in boards, but also structurally how we might kind of shift what the governance models are a little bit to enable that. Because, of course, nobody likes to fail, but actually you have to be able to take risks. You have to be able to try things out. And if you're trying things out, some things will fail. Like you have to be able to kind of manage that process of some things failing and picking yourself up and making another decision and shifting to something else the next day. And I don't think we're as good at that as we need to be, as we're going to need to be.
I guess that's something that can help when you can bring leaders together in the format that you guys do, because essentially you can spread that risk. If someone can, take a punt on something, take a risk, on one instance and share the learnings from that, then someone else, another organisation leader can do that as well. So I guess that's where that kind of network can help with that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'd like to. We talked a lot about kind of funding and finances, but And I'd like to touch on that again, but from a slightly different angle, because it does get talked about a lot in the sector. But sometimes I feel there's a risk that the push to be more profitable, to be more financially stable, can create a risk that pulls art centres away from their social mission, from their civic duty. Do you feel that's the case, or do you feel the two can actually reinforce each other?
I think the two can reinforce each other. I mean, you are an art centre for your mission, your vision, and that's the thing that's going to make you. That's the thing that's going to keep you going in a way. So I think it is about balance, as we've kind of talked about. But I think sometimes people talk about the kind of the conflict between kind of commercial and artistic or charitable within art centres. And I think of it more as a tension, and I think it's a really helpful tension, because I think it is what sustains us financially in terms of our business models. It's what makes us resilient, and it's what makes it's what makes sure that the artistic work we're doing, the community facing work we're doing, is the right work, because we can't afford to do anything that isn't. So it keeps us sharp in terms of our purpose. So I guess that's why I like working in art centres, because I kind of embrace that tension and think it's kind of at the heart of the organisation. Some people find it really, really hard to kind of navigate that, and do describe it as a conflict. And I sympathise with that, because it's taken me however many years I've worked in art centres to get to the point where I can now embrace it. So I definitely recognise it as a challenge. But I would say they're not at odds with each other. I don't know if you've got a different view, Gavin.
No, I agree. They don't have to be at odds with each other. I mean, you can see that tension. You can see an imbalance in places. It does happen. Of course, it can happen. And, you know, there are things which maybe contradict values, or which kind of produce an unhealthy kind of tension. But in general, I think art centres demonstrate that it can be a really healthy tension, and can kind of work positively, interact positively for the greater benefit, for sure.
But yeah, again, it is another example of the unique challenge that the sector and art centres in particular have. Is, you know, it's like we want to be profitable, but you need to kind of be in balance with your kind of social responsibilities too, which only adds to the pressure, right? And I guess, coming back to your point about loneliness and pressure within the job, this is why the role of future art centres is so important, because these are very kind of, for me, it feels like very unique pressures that you don't really get in many roles in other sectors.
I think it's fair to say that there is a tendency to think of commercial and business and profit as bad words, as negatives. And I think, you know, within the right balance, they shouldn't be, and we should be very confident about thinking about those things as part of what we have to do, what we do. Yeah.
Well, we talked a lot about the challenges. I'd love to end more optimistically and look to the future now. What does long-term sustainability look like for art centres? Is it about new income streams, better advocacy, different relationships with local authorities, or most likely all of the above?
I think it probably is all of the above. I think there is we have to adapt to the new reality around public subsidy. As Gavin said, we've got to keep up demonstrating the value of public subsidy and make sure we retain it. But I don't think it's not going to double or triple in the next few years. So I think there's that need to adapt is key. I think better demonstrating our impact, as we've talked about, so that actually art centres are really recognised for their artistic and social contribution and the potential that they've got to contribute even more. So I think that would definitely be a focus for me in terms of sustainability. And then ultimately the thing that will really mean that we are sustainable is to just stay relevant to our communities. If we're doing what our communities need, then we will be important to them, and therefore will be relevant and hopefully valued, and then public subsidy, commercial income, all of the things that keep us going will follow. So yeah, I think they're probably the things that I would say.
No, I think I absolutely agree with all of that. But I suppose maybe I'm always an optimist, but, and of course there's lots of issues and problems that we're all dealing with. But I just think there's still a huge untapped potential in art centres. And actually, if you think about their absolutely unique role as part of the important cultural and social infrastructure of the country, and what that can really achieve, I think, there is real untapped potential in what we're doing. So although it's really difficult, I think there are lots and lots of positives in terms of a kind of sustainable and growing art centre sector within the wider cultural sector.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, if there's one thing you would like art centres leaders to take away from our conversation today, what would you want it to be?
I think it's probably what Gavin just said. Like, now is a brilliant time to run an art centre. I wouldn't want to be running any other kind of arts organisation right now. I think we are best placed to adapt to the current challenges and circumstances. I think we're best placed to meet the needs of local people. So I think it's a great time to run an art centre. So keep going would be my message.
God, we are positive, aren't we, at this point? But still, no, I absolutely do agree with that. I think also a sense that what you're doing now is probably better than you think it is, both as a leader and as the organisation. I think, actually value the kind of amazing work that you're doing and the impact you're having, and focus on that and build on that.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Annabel. Thanks, Gavin. That comes to the end of our conversation. I've really enjoyed it. What I've really enjoyed most is the kind of honesty about the challenges, but it doesn't feel too burdenous. It feels very achievable to kind of work past a lot of the challenges, and I think that's what I've really appreciated from our conversation today. And I hope others listening feel the same, because there are a lot of challenges that we've kind of spoken about that face art centres, but at the same time, there's a lot of practical ways that you guys are helping with leaders, but also the rest of the sector, and even support from local government and national government as well. So for those listening who want to learn more about future art centres, their research and how they're advocating for the sector, you can find them at futureartcentres.org.uk. As I mentioned earlier, they publish a lot of reports on there that I think are well worth reading and checking up on a regular basis. Their most recent report on the state of art centres is really worth a read if you want to understand the financial realities, but also the opportunities facing the sector. Are there any other resources that you guys read or look for within the sector that you think others should stay abreast of?
Oh, it's hard to name one, isn't it? I mean, constantly browsing what other people are doing, I guess. I think just endlessly curious about not just other parts of the art sector, but other sectors as well. So I would always encourage people to read beyond the art sector.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you again for sharing your time and insights with us today. And I'd love to speak again soon. We kind of feel like we've just scratched the surface and there's so much to unpick. So maybe we'll get to speak again in future. But until next time, take care and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Beth.